Hey, welcome everybody. Good to see you. Welcome to your Nature Journal Educators Forum with your hosts, John Muir Laws, Billy Joe Reed, and Ivea, the Mad Botanist Moore. Um, it's good to see all of you today. Um, I thought it would be fun to do a report on the deduction activity that I did with my niñas and their class, and because there's some really interesting things that happened, and I get to finish it today. All right. So if you folks remember, not too long ago, I shared with you folks a little bit of planning that I was doing for a new nature journaling activity that I was going to try in just a few hours with my daughters and a group of kids from their school. And I got a lot of useful ideas from people in the community here, and I ran off to try it. I want to report back on you to you on the results of that activity because I think there's something really useful here. So if you remember, what the big idea is, I want to help people kind of figure out the difference between deduction and induction. And um, deduction is when you take a general premise and you say, if that's true, then all these other sorts of things I should expect to see them. Then these other things are true. If that's true, this is true. That's deduction. So from this premise, here's these other things that fall out from that. And induction is I'm looking around for all sorts of different clues and trying to figure out about them, and then I compare them to other things and kind of make some general principles about the world by looking at a lot of things and then generalizing. So deduction is from when I go from the specific to general, and the induction is the reverse of that. So it's confusing because everybody thinks that what Sherlock Holmes was supposed to do was supposed to be deduction, but he's actually doing induction. So that causes a lot of people just confusion about deduction versus induction. But the but I wanted to explore this with these kids. And so this is my deduction activity. And if you remember, I'm going to bop over to the thrill cam here. All right. So I had this box of clues, and these are all clues that I found underneath a tree. And I brought these clues into the school, and I showed them to the kids. And now this, again, this is something that if you were in a really kind of rich environment, you could just walk out and find clues on the forest floor. But because this school is sort of in an asphalt jungle, I have to go grab things and bring them indoors. So this is just a pile of scraps I found under the tree. And what I said to the kids is, I found these all under the same tree. There seems to be some sort of relationship between these. And I'd like you folks to sort of figure out how these things are related, either in shape or in time, and what's the connections between them, and sort of see if you can sort them and put them in, is it possible to put them in an order that shows the relationships between them? And I then divided them up into three groups, and each group got the same number of pieces that sort of had the same basic shape. And the first thing that they did is they sorted them. So they put all things like this in one pile together. They put all sorts of things like this in another pile together. So they first sorted, and then they started saying, then they said, let's get a little bit more sophisticated, and what is the relationship between these? And we decided we're going to try to make these little timelines of what changes into what, or it's something that shows how they are connected. And from this, there were and they then were, so they started to, let me just sort of show you what they were doing. They're kind of going like, okay, it's getting bigger, all right, and what they did is they came up with their guess about how things kind of grew and developed. And there were three groups. Two groups came up with this basic plan. Let me show you. That they said that it starts with these, right? And then what happens is these things start growing on the sides of these. And they kind of grow from this end up. And so eventually they kind of work their way to the top, right? Like that. So this one is all the way up. And then they open up like this. And then sometimes those start to then fall apart after they're open up. And that's what these are. That is these things, after they open up, they're falling apart like that. All right? So two groups came up with that. There was a third group that came up with an alternate explanation of what might be going here. So let me actually go over to a share screen here. And all right, Avea, are you looking at a page that says deduction?
I am. It's I can also see sort of an untitled edit thing behind it, so it looks as though it's in a program.
Let me stop the share and see if I can reshare that and see if this looks better. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thumbs up. All right, so these are all scraps found on the ground when you kind of walk under the tree. This is how it looks. Just all these sort of pieces lying around underneath this tree. And here are the two strategies, the two sorts that people made. If you look along the top, variation A is that you start with these things and then they kind of grow from the bottom up more, and finally you get into these. The other strategy that people came up with, they said it actually starts with these little cones. The people up here didn't really have the little cones in their explanation. It was sort of a stage that they didn't quite know what to do with, because these were shorter than this whole thing. But nonetheless, this one worked into to bees. They say they start with these things, and then one of two things happens. Either they open up like this, and then sometimes those then re-break apart, or they decided that there's somebody who's eating them and tearing them apart from the top down, like that, and eventually leaving this behind with all these little pieces. So in one case, at the start, it's with this, and in the other case, it's at the end that that same piece is. Isn't that interesting? So one group said this. The other group had this forked path like that. And then what I did is I asked them, right, with the one that you oh, and they both made also in their journals a diagram of these sort of flow charts of what their group said and the other group said. And then I asked them, if your explanation of the relationships of this is true, what would you expect to see if you went out and looked up into the tree? Right? What would you expect to see? If that's true, what would you expect to see on the branches of the tree? So you see where this is going. And so they talked about this and then they presented to the group. And I would be curious to know what you think. So if there's this one that starts with this and ends with this, if that one, and also part of this was fun. We wanted terms to communicate with each other about what these different stages were. And so they wanted to name them things like, this is the acorn or the core or these sorts of things. But you see, those terms are kind of loaded. Those are loaded terms. If you name something the core, that tells you that it is the core. And that's different than, calling it, the start. If you call it the start, then you think it's at the start. And it's hard to have the start at the end. So they came up with names for these different stages that did not bias their thinking towards what stage it was. So for instance, this is the chainsaw. That's the chainsaw. All right. This was wings. All right. So in one case, you're going from chainsaw to wings. And the in the other case, they are going starting with the little armadillo and then either going to wings or alternatively to chainsaw. Now, if the one that goes from chainsaw to wings, if that's true, I'd like everybody, don't hit send yet, but I'd like you to make your predictions of and put into the chat what you're going to see if you look up into the branches of the tree. Again, the chainsaw approach was something like this to this to this. This is A, so version A. It's going to go from this to this. What are you expecting to see if you look up into the branches of the tree? And put that in. And in just a moment, we're all going to hit send. Let's hit send. Everybody, let me know what you expect to see if you look up into the branches of the tree. Now, the girls felt they would see, so again, so we're saying if it starts with this, and then they grow through these stages into this, what are you going to expect to see? And what they felt was they would probably see, these, and then some of these, and then maybe some of these, and maybe some of these, but a whole bunch of these ones. They're saying that if these started it, they felt that the group felt that they would start with by seeing chainsaws up there. Now, there's that other strategy that they said they're going to start with the armadillos and either end with wings or end with chainsaws. What would they expect to see up in the branches of the tree? Type it in, but don't hit send yet. So if it's starting with this and ending with one of these, and this they felt was probably gnawed and torn apart by an animal, what would you expect to see up there in the branches of the tree? And hit send. Let me know what you thought. They would expect, yeah. So they're expecting to see a bunch of armadillos. Um, and then maybe wings and chainsaws on the ground. You see, the next stage is we sort of looked at this and we noticed that there are opposite predictions coming from these two possible plausible explanations. First, I let them know that based on what you've seen, these are two great possible explanations for what's going on here. But at this point, we don't know. We don't have all the data. But we can say, if that's true, here's what I can expect to see. And we noticed that the predictions were different. So if those predictions are different, I asked them, what is their next step? And they said, let's go out and look at the tree. Now, unfortunately, this schoolyard is not where the tree is, because it's just, there's asphalt, there's asphalt. Oh, and there's a little bit of asphalt. But what I did do is I said that we're going to take an explorer from the class who is going to report back with a tree climb. So that brings us to what we're going to do with them today. And let's take a look. Right? So again, we have these two strategies. A is we're starting with the chainsaws and we're ending with the wings. The other started with little armadillos that turned into bigger armadillos and either turned into wings or the armadillos slowly turned into chainsaws, and then these little pieces they called nuggets. The nuggets were the pieces of the armadillos or the wings that had been nibbled off. Well, here is my explorer, and we sent her up the tree. So she helped me kind of get some more data, and I want to show you what we find when we look up into the branches of the trees. First of all, if you look towards the trunk of the tree, inside the tree, we found an awful lot of wings in there, no chainsaws, and no armadillos. That was close to the tree. But I noticed that somebody said out on the tips of the branches. We also sent our explorer out towards the tips of the branches. And when we looked out towards the tips of the branches, the further you got out, the more armadillos you'd find. So wings seem to be inside the tree, but armadillos towards the outside. And this is an interesting one right here. Look at this one. It's part wing and part armadillo. Huh. Isn't that interesting? But out towards the tips of the tree, there were only armadillos. And you could look around in a bunch of different places, and this pattern seemed to be fairly consistent. That the closer you got into the core of the tree, the more wings you would find. Out towards the edges of the tree, there were armadillos of different size. If you look, here's a small armadillo. And that is what we found. We did not find any chainsaws in the branches of the tree. There were no chainsaws in the branches of the tree. So our little explorer looked around, looked on multiple branches, not a chainsaw in sight. However, the floor was covered with chainsaws. So let's go back to our those two predictions. This set of observations supports one of these, and it does not support the other. And that is really interesting. And so what we can do is we're using the process of deduction to come up with a prediction. And where we didn't see this process happen. But we can make predictions. We can say, if this explanation is true, here's what we should expect to see. And then we can go out and look for it. So today, we're going to show them the results of what was found in the tree. And we're going to, as a group, discuss how we can use this information to help us figure out what's going on with these. And in addition to that, what is the strength of our explanation? So how strongly do we think we're right? Right? And that's my lesson plan for when I go back into that classroom today. So I wanted to first of all thank this group for encouraging me to kind of go slow with this. I wanted to do all of this in one lesson. This will actually be the third lesson where we did this. In our first lesson, I took your advice. We just observed. They drew these different parts, they diagrammed them, and they started to kind of think about how might these be connected or related to each other. And then, how are they similar, how are they different? In the next one, they sorted them. And today we're going to give them the final piece where we're going to show them the pictures of what we found in the tree. So thank you for the suggestions to go to that less is more, and we gave them a chance to kind of come up with those. I would love to hear your thoughts about this and comments and feedback. And so as educators, what do you think? So you can use the raise hand button, or you can physically raise your hand, and we'll see you. I'd love to get some thoughts, comments, and ideas about these different strategies. So again, you can use the raise hand function, or you can just raise your hand. So thoughts, comments, and ideas. Oh, y'all are being shy today. Let's jump over to the Mad Botanist. Hello.
Hello. One thing I really appreciate that I will shamelessly borrow is the way that the kiddos came up with different names for each of the parts: chainsaws, wings, and armadillos. I like those because there's no intuitive leap you can make between them. Armadillos, wings, no exact connection because like one's about a bird, one's about an animal. Chainsaws, that's not even in the category of like animal, mineral, vegetable. I mean, that's, I guess, minerals. But I like that they have terms that you cannot make automatic mental connections with, because then that leaves for a lot more freedom to form hypotheses and to try to look at the evidence without, like what you said earlier about loaded terms. So I like that, and I'm stealing it.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, people are noticing that this is what we're doing it's an it reminds me of. So some descriptive term, what does this remind you of? This reminded them of the armadillo. This reminded them of the chainsaw. So you're right. So we did, in that first day, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, with words, pictures, and numbers, and put those all down on our paper. And that's where the term armadillo and chainsaw came from. And it was, when we first started I said, let's name these. And they were kind of, they wanted to, like, this is a bud, right? If we're naming something a bud, we've just forced ourselves to kind of have one answer. If this had been called the bud, everybody would have come up with the same explanation. Right? Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Other thoughts, comments, ideas. Let me go to my gallery view.
Jack, I'm just seeing in the chat, a couple of people are asking questions in the chat. Kate was wondering, how long are your sessions with each of the class? How long do you have with each of them?
I had about 50 minutes.
Okay. And then maybe bring in Aisha, because she's wondering, she put in that it reminds me also of science flow of action, concepts, vocab, with vocab being last. So that might be an interesting.
Aisha, is it right to add you to the spotlight here? Yeah, tell me your thinking about this.
Sure. Yeah, it reminded me of there was the book called Teaching Science. I can't remember the full title, put out by the National Science Teachers Association. And I stumbled across it a few years ago, and it had a few models. And the one that really jumped out at me was called ACV. And I was trying to get all our teachers to shift their thinking, which was no matter what you're teaching, start with an action, engaging the kids in the phenomenon. Let them, we were very constructivist school, right? IB, let them construct what's going on. Is the concept, you know, in this case, life cycle, or being, you know, food items, or is it, you know, gravity? But the term is not important. And many teachers start with the term, mostly because that's how they were taught too, right? I was certainly taught that way. And that vocabulary comes last, as almost the least important piece. Like, do they get the phenomenon? You know, it doesn't matter what words they use to explain it, because they said it's often kids can fool you in schools by throwing out all the right vocabulary. And if you really start digging, you realize they actually don't understand the concept behind it. So just what you were doing with the renaming reminded me of that whole science flow that I've always used in my teaching, and always remind myself of the acronym was ACV, action, concept,
That's really useful.
vocabulary.
So ACV.
I don't know what BRB is from Billy Joe. Meanwhile,
Yeah, Billy Joe, what's burb?
Bring your own bird.
Yeah.
Be right back. I just have to grab some water.
Oh, got it. So yeah, maybe other people have used that, you know, and it's quick and short. You know, there's all those other science flows, the 5 E's and the 7 E's, and I would lose my mind somewhere between them, and I'd be like, just give me 3, that my brain can hang on to 3.
Yeah.
And action, concept, vocabulary just kind of got to the nub of what every time I went off on I'll introduce this way, I'd be like, wait, how am I getting them doing something first? Like sorting, in your case, observing and sorting, and they're mucking around with it. And then they're developing
That's really
concepts.
useful. That's really useful. And you're right, you know, so often, and you know, teachers will start by, here's your vocabulary list, memorize these. And everybody's like, why don't people get excited about science?
Yeah.
And when you especially when you kind of contrast that with a very kind of common way of presenting this information. That is.
Yeah, and you know, there's a bias. It's reminding me of there's a bias. So society shows respect to people who can use fancy vocabulary. And you'll, you know, you feel better about yourself if you know the right vocabulary, the extended vocabulary, but you know, what's with that? And I love words, you know, it's not to say I don't love that vocabulary, and a new word like stenotherm. Well, that's really cool that there's an actual word. But it sometimes downplays understanding it or really observing it.
Yeah. That you're right. So both sometimes our terms can stand in for our observing, and also that they can act as a sort of as kind of gatekeepers. If you don't know the vocabulary, do you really have a place at the table? And
yeah, that's so well put. And you know what it actually reminds me of is something you inspired me with years ago on the Sierra Nevada trip. It's sort of the same over idea. You were like, so you've named that bird and moved on, right?
Yeah.
And how it can hinder from going deeper with observing that individual bird and understanding that bird.
Yeah. So these names and labels can be useful for us to communicate with each other when we all want to be talking about the same thing when we say chainsaw. And so having terms that everybody uses are great, but those terms then can construct how you are thinking about it. So yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's right. So then the other piece of this is that the terms themselves, depending on what they are, they frame the way that you are thinking about any problem or situation, the language and vocabulary that you use. Um, Excellent. So thus we have the chainsaws.
And the armadillos,
So
because
aren't they?
I
Doesn't that
mean,
make this cuter?
it's so fun. I go to Texas and I run around trying to see armadillos because my sister lives there and I'm obsessed with trying to see an armadillo every time I go.
That's a good goal. Life is better with more armadillos. Now here's an interesting thing. Um, did you know that um, armadillos are a natural? I learned this because I married an infectious disease geek. That the armadillo is the natural reservoir for Hansen's disease, leprosy. And that is really, really interesting.
And do
Um,
they exhibit symptoms? Do they get it
no,
also?
they're just like, I got scales. I'm a man. I'm cool. They're just running around being little armadillos, but um, they can, you know, they can handle that. Go, little armadillo. Um, so yeah, the I hadn't planned to do that language thing, but the language thing just sort of came up once they started naming these things in ways that would bias their thinking. I said, like, I kind of interrupted them, but now I'm thinking that that wants to be an intentional part of the flow of an activity like this. So I like the way you've kind of highlighted that. See, does anybody else want a piece in on this? Um, Thoughts? Let's join Rosa and Spotlight.
Cool. So, briefly about armadillos, I am originally from Louisiana, which was the site of the last operating leprosarium in the United States. Armadillos are common there, and partly because of their role as a reservoir for Hansen's disease, which was once referred to as leprosy. Um, there was both an opportunity for more study and also, I believe, a higher incidence in the general population. As treatments have advanced, it is no longer necessary to have, remote sanitariums, as they were once called. Um, so, I hadn't expected that to come up today. Uh, the other thing I wanted to say, though, about vocabulary is that even as adults, so I'm coming to our group thinking about continuing education or working with adults across the range, right? And there are two things I wanted to say in particular about vocabulary. One is that often people have reading pronunciations for words that they have learned as readers. And it can be very easy to want to jump in and just correct people's pronunciation. However, if you pay attention, I've noticed that when one does that, or when it gets done in front of me, you can see the micro expressions on the face of the person who has said the word wrong.
Yeah.
And like their face starts to fall. Their
You've
emotional
just been
response.
vocab shamed for being
Yes,
an autodidact.
yes, and I would like to encourage all of us to think hard about that, because um, how amazing is it that someone has been picking up vocabulary, not just about how to identify
Yeah.
plants, but in general, on their own, without this learning infrastructure that that many of us have been through a more formal educational process, right? But also just having access to the vocabulary, um, can be helpful. And so I think that when we present like, oh, here's all the words you need to know before we can even begin to talk about the phenomenon that's being discussed, like in a session, a class, or in a group, I feel like that starts to shut down some of the discussion. So the example I want to bring you is that, as I've mentioned a few times, but I don't know if everyone here knows, I participate in a group that's called Better Living with Back Pain. And we have an 8-week session, and sometimes people come back for multiple sessions, and sometimes we've got new people, coming in. And there's an exercise that they do where they, put up a anatomical diagram. It's got like all these little arrows pointing to all these bits of your back and how they all work, and are very scientific, right? So it's not just like, oh, my neck hurts, or like, oh, well, the cervical facet joint interaction with this other process, and that gets, what I've noticed is that some of the people participating don't engage with that vocabulary.
Yeah.
So I saw Kate in the chat say, a sheet of vocabulary feels like a treasure trove. And I agree entirely. I am a reader of glossaries. Like if I get a book and there's a glossary in the back, like I'll want to go read the whole glossary and get all those words in my head. However, as we know, we don't all learn the same way, right? And I feel like Jack's exercise about the coming up with different names and doing experiential learning, engaging with the objects themselves apart from the names of the objects, is just really philosophically interesting. And it seems to have been productive in your group of kids. And that brings me back to a thing that I brought up last week about artificial intelligence in the classroom. Like as we start to, foment our ideas about like, how's this even going to go? Are they just going to all be cheating the kids? Well, what is it we want them to learn? If we want them to learn how to think, then just having a sheet of vocabulary so they can just like grab the word they need in conversation, rather than assuming that they need to memorize all of the words perfectly first to get their seat at the discussion table. So in a classroom setting, I feel like there are often students who, tune out. They're just like, that's too many words. I can't even. Whereas the experience of being like, oh, what does this remind me of? Oh, look, it's a little armadillo. Is engaging. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what
I'm the son of somebody who studied Latin and Greek and loved to kind of geek out on words. My dad had so many dictionaries, dictionaries. He got the large set of the OED, and the the words are useful. Words are important, and with this ACV thing, I think it is stressing that the vocabulary is really useful and important. So much that in a 3-letter acronym, it's one of those letters, but it's not. It's not VAC, right? It's not VAC. What they're saying is just do that, but don't lead with it. And that those words sort of help us with our meaning and thing. The so I don't think that they're saying with this ACV not to do vocabulary, but that put that by the sort of in a different place, and then that gives you room before the terms. And also, I find that sometimes when there's an idea and I feel like I need a term for it, and then I get my term, that is more useful for me than like, here's a term for you that you can use. But sometimes I kind of have a feeling like there should be a word for this. Oh, there is. Oh, cool. I didn't know there was a word for that. And but that's much more significant to me than when I get a word before I have need of it. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for those ideas. Um, I'm going to bounce over to the gallery view. Oh, we've got two hands up. I see Kate and Molly. Kate, let's bring you on, and then Molly, you're up after Kate. Hey there, Kate. Hold on. You may now unmute.
Aloha. So I had I had one quick question about your lesson and then some thoughts about language stuff. Did you allow the kids or encourage the kids to like dissect the pine cones at all, or were you trying to keep them whole for the lesson? Or
They actually asked about that, and I told them they could manipulate them any way they wanted to.
okay, cool. And then and did they do that?
One kid did in particular. One, actually, no, two kids. One,
Because I just see that and I just want to like pull off all those little wings, but
right,
that's
but that's what one of those kids wanted to do, and what that kid discovered was that they're really hard to take off.
ah.
And so that ended up being a really useful kind of data point for them, that these things, they're really in there. And so whatever force was doing this was significant. It wasn't just like, oh, it fell. They decided like this, I'm with my big boy strength. That is actually, I mean, if you look at my fingers, there's little indentations in them from where I was pulling so hard. And that didn't come off. So that you're right. And so yeah, messing with things like that, I think is useful.
There's a question in the chat, is if they had any tools available to do that.
They did not. They didn't have any tools to do that.
It's just curious. Okay, cool. But mines are tools. Yeah, please, your mines. Okay, cool. And then my question was like, were you planning on introducing vocabulary now? And like, how do you do that where it's a kind of gentle way? Because I had kind of an experience yesterday where I was encouraging the students to do tallies of the birds that they saw and to just come up with their own names for the birds and not worrying about identifying them, because they're like, I don't know what kind of bird that is. Like, don't worry about it. And now I'm wondering, how do I then like introduce those names for the birds? I think with birds, it's almost easier because I can give them a bird book and say, okay, now based on your observations and what you remember, like now you can find those birds in the book. And so it's kind of a more organic way. And the bird book I have actually has like the, Native Hawaiian name, and it has the common name, and it has the scientific name, and it has, descriptions of behaviors. And so it's kind of more student led, like, oh, now I'm going to find, the term. Are you going to do you have any ideas of that?
Yeah, I'm going to give they're going to know that this is a cone by the time they're done and not an acorn. And I had a similar experience with that. I did an activity when, years ago when I was I was working in the Teton Science School, and I had one point where we had everybody do a description, like pretend you're a botanist. You're the first person to find this plant. You do a description of it. And this was in an area that, a lot of earlier explorers explorers had been through there. They'd looked at stuff with the Lewis and Clark expedition and how there's like the Lewis's woodpecker and Lewisia and the Clark's nutcracker and all these things that were named after Lewis and Clark. But if they did a description of this, they then got to name it. And so this, the lodgepole pine, I remember Peter Rainier drew the lodgepole pine and did a description of it. And from that point on, the kids knew the other name for this is the lodgepole pine, but we all referred to it as the Rainier pine for all the rest of that summer. And then the next year, we kept referring to it as the Rainier pine because of Peter. And so the names, when you're communicating, the name is just useful for communicating to people. So if I say the Rainier pine and you have no idea what I'm talking about, my term is not really useful. But just remember that these names are arbitrary things that somebody else decided to call it the lodgepole. But they could have named it something else, right? So sometimes naming things, you're coming up with your own name for things is really useful. And then sometimes you can get sort of a standardized name. And even if you look across, like common names for most things are not standardized. For plants, for instance, you can get away with calling a plant just about anything. For birds in different countries, they're standardized, but they're different in different countries. In some cases, you call that animal a loon. In other cases, it's a diver. And so I think that I like your idea of letting them come up with their own names. Then you can find the other name for it. And also realize, can we get, and especially because you're on Hawaii, are there any other names in other languages for these things? And then it helps people understand the utility of something like a Latin name. Because if I say myrtlewood, or California myrtle, or California bay, or California laurel, or California laurel, or all these different sort of things, or Oregon myrtle, right? All those are common names for the same plant. But if I say Umbularia californica, that's all the scientists immediately know what I'm talking about. So that also has a use to it. So it helps people you can have fun with the names, but also realize that there's sort of these odd sort of scientific, these 2-word names that are by each thing. The purpose of that is because names are so goofy. And so you can play with that. Oh, and actually just thinking about Peter Rainier, this kid that was in my class years ago when I was teaching at the Teton Science School. This is sort of reminding me of something kind of that Rosa was talking about. When somebody is self-taught, this kid fell in love with birds. And every chance he got, he would pick up his binoculars and he would go running around with birds. Well, there's this person in the valley who was like the big bird watcher guy. And, these people sometimes have egos. Like this person had written the book on birds of the Tetons. And because I was working at the school, I got this kid permission to get in on this class on birding that this person was leading. And Peter was really, really excited about that. And Peter was one of these people, you go out in the field with him, he's spotting all the birds that you didn't see. So I brought him out there, he's doing this, and he's like, look, over there, there's out there in the pond, way out there, there's a pied-billed grebe. And this experienced sort of sage of birding just kind of looks at him and with this dismissive voice and goes, it's called a grebe. I have never turned more red and furious with any educator than this guy who was telling this kid who had learned it on his own. The reason he's calling it a grebe is because he's so into it that he has learned this on his own.
I understand. So on the epistemological topic, like how do we know what we know? Modeling for the different age groups we work with or different situations we work with, that there are these different kinds of language. And within the space of that 50 minutes in a particular classroom, you're all agreeing that we call this an armadillo, and we call this a wing, and
Yeah.
we call this, whatever other words you came up with in the group. But you can actually, take a meta jump out and say, that's what we're doing here. And if you want to talk about these things with other people outside of this classroom, here are the names that are commonly used for these parts. And so I think giving the extra bit of insight that, like, we're not just playing, like, language in this case is a tool. Well, it's always a tool, but in this case, you're using, in the Swiss Army knife of language, you're using the tool of playfulness and analogy to destigmatize the idea that you need this whole list of terms to be able to talk about the phenomenon of
Yeah.
what's going on over time with the object from the tree. What I've been grappling with over these weeks, the last couple of months, as more fervor and dismay has been arising around artificial intelligence, which is algorithmic intelligence. They're not sentient,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But noticing who is upset has been fascinating. So this guy, I'll call him Pompous. So this Pompous guy, who has all of this knowledge, is so insecure about it that he needs to, like, one up the kid who has learned it all on his own, rather than valuing, like, feeling awestruck that some kid
Yeah.
has been learning all this stuff on their own. And one of the things I've written in our notes from last week is not knowing is a strength. And as instructors or guides, saying, yeah, I don't know that thing, let's look it up together, I think is so powerful. And particularly as we're agitated as a culture, as an educational culture, about these new tools, like, calculators are pretty cool, and gatekeeping math because somebody can't do mental arithmetic quickly enough, or you know I could talk for days about this. That those are some the particular thing I wanted to bring up was how you're using language to communicate, and stepping outside of that to explain to the kids, like, oh, hey, yeah, we just made up these words, and we can talk to these other people when we learn this set of words. And if you want to be a professional scientist, there's even another layer of language where you get even more precise about exactly which plant this is.
Yeah, I think those. I like what I really like about what you're thinking about there is you're thinking, you're bringing into the lesson thinking about how we think, and language is an important part of that, and just being really intentional about that. I think that is really useful. Now, Kate, you were also in the middle of an idea.
No,
You
I
didn't
just
want
was
to derail
thinking,
that.
yeah, like I do want to empower students when they leave the room to have at least, like, how do you correct gently though? Because I also wonder if that guy in the field was just saying it. He maybe didn't, I mean, like the kindest.
It had a real edge.
It
to
had the real
tone.
term.
And
Yeah.
also and also the impact that it had on this kid, he was I felt like the instructor was intentionally shaming him, and the result was the kid felt shamed. He just, he didn't pipe up anymore for the rest of the day, and he just had this incredible love of birds, but was just
Right,
ground down
which
there.
is super hurtful, but there
Yeah.
is this desire to have the student walk out into the world and have the correct term, like to
Yes.
be able to say
That's
it
right.
correctly,
That's
so that
right.
they're not just walking around saying it in a way that is going to kind of, people are going to be like, wait, what do you know,
Right.
because I was
Right.
saying plover instead of plover, and learning how to say it correctly means that, like, now when I say it, I'm like, yes, I'm saying this right. And so I guess it's just kind of like an interesting question, is like, how do you provide them, without saying like you have to say it correct every time, or you have to use this term every time, but if you're going to use this term, let's learn how to use it. It's just kind of a question that comes up.
I think part of it could be done just by your role modeling. When you say plover, you can say plover. And then all the plover people will go like, oh. And the
So like saying like, oh yeah, I see the grebe too, or wait, is
yes,
that the right?
exactly, yeah.
Right, yeah, okay.
And great. Look, yeah, Peter spotted the grebe way down there. Good spotting. Instead of, it's pronounced grebe. Like really? It was heavy-handed. And so yeah, no, I think words are useful. I think words are really, really interesting. There's a whole other conversation about names of things, and that I think we could probably have another time, that is, also about when things are named after people. And that gets, there's actually a movement to change some bird names, because a number of bird names are in the United States are named after people that perhaps we don't want to be honoring. And so that becomes sort of when we're picking these common names for things, what are we using? It's a whole other very, very interesting conversation, but I think that would be like a big can of worms for this workshop, but maybe we can explore that another time.
Ivana wanted to bring in something from Jamaica Kincaid, and obviously I don't know exactly what you were going to bring in, Ivana, but it was about naming, and I know that that she has talked a lot about naming and people and colonialism. And I don't know if, sorry, I wanted to point at Ivea because
also I've lost track of the queue. So I also see that Molly, I've forgotten that you had your hand up. I really, really apologize. I was not trying to ignore you. I see that Rebecca and Heather and Ivea have something to share into this. Let's see, what's the best way to do this? Maybe let's just kind of keep in order of the way that these little hands appeared on my screen. And I'm going to bring Molly in, and Molly, you can unmute, then Rebecca and Heather and Avea, and then I think we'll be at the point where we're going to have to wrap up, because I'm going to have to go teach this final lesson to that group of kids. And let me see here. I need to now find, there's Molly. Add you into the spotlight. Hey there, sorry to keep you waiting.
No worries at all. This is my first educator forum, and I am loving this conversation. So I'm really excited to be here.
By the way, please come back, because this is actually where I think some of the most interesting conversations in this community are happening, is in this forum. Really interesting stuff, and
yeah.
You'll get thoughts that really kind of stretch your mind and sometimes make us feel uncomfortable in a really, really good way. But the group of people who are doing it are really kind and respectful to each other. So there's it makes for good conversation. But we're delighted that you're with us.
Yeah, I work for state parks in Santa Cruz, so I'm really excited to incorporate some of these things. But one thing I wanted to mention that I really loved about this is at the beginning, when you showed the two students that did like the A process and then the B process, I honestly found myself, even though I know what a chewed up pine cone looks like, I was like, wait, do pine cones grow that way? Like, oh my God, have I been mistaken this my entire life? And I loved how it forced me to think outside of the box, just in the way that the students arranged it. And I remember in, I think it was one of the Wild Wonder talks that I think Marley did. He talked about using I Notice, I Wonder, it reminds me of, and pretending to be an alien and like you don't know anything, you know, and really trying to prevent yourself from using things you know and using biases. And I just loved that moment of like, wow, do I not know how pine cones get torn apart when you
Oh,
show that? And that was just really, really fun for me. So I think the way you led the activity was awesome. So I just wanted to mention that.
well, thank you. Yeah, it is fun when people were talking about epistemology earlier. You know, how do we know what we know? And very often, I discover that the amount of evidence behind something that I just assumed I knew because that's the right answer. The amount of evidence that I'm moving on is weak.
Mhm.
And you know, how do I really know that? Well, somebody once told me, huh, we call that hearsay, right? So yeah, this is I I do like that part of it because there's this point where you're legitimizing both ways of having laid them out and saying like that I see how you're making those connections. Great. But then if that's true, we can make a prediction from it. And that I think also is just useful about the nature of science. That if there is an explanation and we can make predictions from it, that allows us to test things. And that I think is pretty powerful. So Molly, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're going to, Rebecca, you can now unmute and we'll bring you into the spotlight here. Hi there. Yes, we can.
Hi, everybody. I am loving this conversation about the words and vocab, this really interesting tangent we've gone on today. So I have one thought to share about that. And then if there's time, I have a question for you, Jack.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so I
And
think
I can call my lifeline if I we can also crowdsource it. Yes.
Yeah, so Aisha had a comment earlier in the chat that if you're introducing vocab, you can use it alongside, like you can explain it and use the vocab at the same time. And so that reminded me of a Tumblr post that I saw about Mojo Jojo from the Powerpuff Girls and how he has which was one of my favorite shows when I was little, and how he is written to have this very distinct speech pattern, which helps to teach English to the kids. And he'll say something and then say the definition of the word after he says it. So it shows this a picture of a message that he wrote for the Powerpuff Girls. It says, "Dear Powerpuff Girls, I have kidnapped Professor Utonium. I have taken him someplace against his will. If you look for him in the spots he likes to be, you will not find him. He's with me, but not by choice. I took him and he didn't like it. This message is from and was written by Mojo Jojo, he's the villain of the cartoon."
Yes.
And but I realized that same concept is in the book Language Making Nature by David Lucas. He talks about how do you introduce new words to a language if you're making up words, if you're making up new words, but you could use the same concept if you're just introducing a word that's new to somebody. So he talks about this guy, Sir Thomas Eliot, who was a pioneer of modern English in the early 1500s and introduced a lot of new words to the English language. And he writes, remarkably, a large number of the words he created or borrowed from classical languages have persisted because he was smart enough to imitate a Middle English technique for presenting new words. And yes, he is part of the nature journal community, not the guy from the 1500s, but David Lucas. So he said his strategy was to pair up newly crafted words alongside words or phrases that were already well known, placing his words in a familiar context and defining them from the moment he introduced them. For example, he presented the following new and now common words with italics in these pairings: animate and give courage, education or bringing up noble children. So there, the word education, or educator's form, it was made up at some point by somebody. Persist and continue. And says providing his readers with an immediate sense of familiarity proved to be an enormously successful tool. The basic task is to position a new or modified word alongside a dictionary-like definition or clarification of what the neologism signifies.
Oh, that is really useful.
And that is Thomas Eliot from the 1500s. And so that, I think, if you just introduce it that way casually, people almost don't even realize that you're teaching them a vocabulary word. And then the people who do already know the word don't feel like you're talking down to them. So you're reaching both at the same time.
Yep.
And yeah, so that's the book is by David Lucas. That's with K. And I'm not correcting you to shame you on your spelling, just so you know who the correct person is. And
he's a wonderful, wonderful naturalist also. I actually called him 2 days ago because I'm trying to get verification of the eye shine reflection color for barn owls versus great horned owls, and was calling around all my sort of a whole bunch of naturalists trying to find out. So by the way, if anybody knows, shoot me a message, because I want to get a verification on that. But yeah, I had a really lovely conversation with David, and how fun that he shows up in this. Alan Fish might be a good person. That's a good idea. But then you had a question.
Yeah, and since you just said that you have to now go and do the last lesson in this series, so you might not have the answer to it yet. But I was just wondering, like I said, I love this tangent we're on about words. I could also talk about this all day, but I'm curious about the original point of our discussion today. Finding a way to teach kids about the difference between deduction and induction, and those concepts, even if you didn't emphasize the vocab. I'm wondering, what was the main takeaway that you wanted them to get from the lesson? And did they get there? Did they understand the difference between those two concepts? Or did they did they have a different takeaway that was also valuable? And maybe you don't know the answer because you haven't finished teaching all the lessons.
I don't know the answer yet. So what, but I there is the role of deduction in science is misunderstood. I have heard people say with a straight face, for instance, that scientists can only make observations to kind of figure things out. But just about everything we're doing in astronomy, paleontology, anthropology, all these sorts of things, we're figuring stuff out about stuff based on not direct. Like recently, they got a new piece of really powerful evidence that Saurischian dinosaurs were warm-blooded, and there's nobody back there sticking a thermometer in the dinosaur, but from a a spectroscopic analysis of bones, they can figure out what kind of, they were figuring out sort of the ratios of certain waste products of oxygen that were residually in the bones, and we're able to compare all these different groups. Nobody was out there sticking a thermometer in a dinosaur, but we can figure these things out based on evidence where we can say, if that's true, I would expect to see. And so there's a lot of science is all the hypothesis testing. It's all people using deduction, but there's still just a lot of confusion about that. So I thought it was an important thing for people to kind of, realize that scientists don't have to be making a direct observation of something. They can be looking at a clue that is sort of derivative of something. But then also what I'm hoping we get into today is also a discussion of that, could I be wrong about that? Right? And yes, I could. And I found strong evidence against one of these hypotheses, the one that starts with the chainsaws. But that's different than saying that doesn't mean that this other one is definitely the right answer. And so we also, I hope to kind of get into a little bit of a little bit of that discussion in them, but I can report back to you on how that goes. So it'll be fun.
Cool. Thank you.
And thank you, Rebecca. And David Lucas may start doing a number of new video explorations with nature journalers in the community. So something to look for in the foreseeable future is perhaps more opportunities of geeking out with David Lucas, a fun naturalist.
I think we should hear from Heather any day now.
I think you're right. Thank you so much for that. Heather, you can now unmute, and I'm going to add you into the spotlight. Hey there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been really fun to be here. So I just had a jumping off point from something Rosa mentioned earlier about being humble and being able to admit when you don't know something. And I just wanted to say that, because I'm a teacher, and one of the things that I've always felt is really, really important in the teaching process, and in the, from the teacher side, and then also the learning process from the student side, is that when you can say, I don't know that answer, but I know where we can find the answer, you are modeling those skills to your student. And because there's a lot of, and I was a reference librarian also for several years, for almost a decade, and you would be surprised at how many people, like, they don't know where to find the answers. They don't even know where to begin looking. And so as, when you're standing in the role of an educator, whether you're in the classroom or in what capacity, if you have the ability to admit when you don't know something and then be able to model the process you go through to find the answer, you're actually teaching them to be more cognizant of that, and it's going to kind of explode in other areas of their life too, because it's like they'll take away from that in other areas, when they run across a time when they don't know the answer, they'll have a process for how to go find the answer. So it's like the modeling aspect of that in the science capacity. You may think you're just teaching it in the science capacity, but the ramifications of it are much wider than that. Yeah. And yeah.
And I absolutely agree with that. And I would also add to that we can teach people kind of where to go to get answers, but very often when we go to, our questions get more nuanced and sophisticated, there's a point where when we go to those places that the answer isn't there.
Yeah.
And that is also really important for kids to realize, that there's a bunch of stuff that is unknown currently.
Yeah.
And there are ways that we can go about trying to figure stuff out. And there are other sorts of things that we will never be able to figure out. And so the whole "I don't know" thing is really empowering, right? There's "I don't know," but somebody else has really geeked out on this, and we can look at what they did. And then there's also "I don't know," and you may be the first person ever to ask that question, and that's huge.
Yeah.
And or sometimes "I don't know," and what's interesting about that kind of question is that that is a kind of question that is ultimately unknowable.
Mhm.
And that also is really interesting. And so for us as educators not to be threatened by any of those categories, something that is knowable that I don't know, right? Something that is knowable but not yet known, and something that is unknowable, all of those are opportunities for us to really think and engage with the world.
Yeah. And then one other thing I wanted to mention too about the language. Just the other day, I watched this amazing TED Talk by a bassist, a musician by the name of Victor Wooten. And he was talking about music, but he was talking about contrasting how we learn music with how we learn language. And he was talking about how when we, as a musician, you go to school, they focus on technique, they focus on skills, and then they shove you off in a practice room and you have to learn on those things in isolation. And he was talking about how when you learn English, he says, nobody ever taught you how to talk. You learned because you were exposed to it. You learned with immersion. And thinking about that in the context of, bringing in new scientific vocabulary and more advanced, concepts that way that have, specific words for them. It's like, I really feel like there's something to that immersive process. I can't remember who mentioned it. It might've been you, about how, you use a word in the context in which it's used, and that kind of helps cement that in us, because past a certain point, like, we already intuitively know all the rules of how to speak English, and nobody ever really taught us. And the whole concept of like English class, when we get into grade school and things like that, all that's doing is giving us vocabulary for the things we already know, like adverbs and verbs and nouns and things. It's like, we already intuitively know what that is. We're just now getting the vocabulary for it. And I think that there's, things about that process that are very applicable with scientific vocabulary as well.
Yeah. And also that kind of ties into one of the best ways to learn another language is by immersion in that language, where everything you're experiencing is in context instead of a list of vocabulary words. Now, thank you so much for those thoughts, Heather. That's really important.
You're welcome.
Let's join the mad botanist. Sorry to make you wait so much.
It's no worries. Yeah, I don't mind at all. This is just more a quote from Jamaica Kincaid that was talking about what we were saying earlier about language. I'll try to be fast because I know that you also have to go soon. Here we go. One day, while looking at the things that lay before me at my feet, I was having an argument with myself over the names I should use when referring to the things that lay before me at my feet. These things were plants. The plants, all of them, and there were hundreds, had two names. They had a common name, that is, the name assigned to them by people for whom these plants have value. And then they have a proper name, or a Latin name, and that is a name assigned to them by an agreed upon group of botanists. For a long time, I resisted using the proper names of the things that lay before me. I believed that it was an affectation to say eupatorium when you could say jopai weed. I then would only say jopai weed. The botanists are from the same part of the world as the man who sailed on the 3 ships, that same man who started the narrative from which I trace my beginnings. And the botanists are like that man who sailed on the ships in a way too. They emptied the world of things animal, mineral, and vegetable of their names and replaced those names with names pleasing to them. The recognized names are now reasonable, as reason is a pleasure to them. And then she goes on a bit about Linnaeus's history. And it finally ends like this. If one does not know the names, one's knowledge of things is useless. It was in George Clifford's greenhouse, and that's a quote that she's saying, it was in George Clifford's greenhouse that Linnaeus gave some things names. The atom-like quality of this effort was lost on him. We revere the Creator's omnipotence. He says, meaning, I think, that he understood he had not made the things he was describing. He was only going to give them names. And even as a relationship exists between George Clifford's activity in the world as it starts out on ships leaving the seaports of the Netherlands, traversing the earth's seas, touching on the world's peoples and places they are in, the things that have meant something to them being renamed, and a whole new set of narratives imposed on them, narratives that place them at a disadvantage in relationship to George Clifford and his fellow Dutch. Even as I can say all this in one breath or in one large volume, so too then does an invisible thread, a thread that no deep breath or large volume can contain, hang between Carolus Linnaeus, his father's desire to give himself a distinguished name, the name then coming from a tree, the linden tree, a tree whose existence was regarded as not ordinary, and his invention of a system of naming that even I am forced to use. Just because I thought it related.
Yeah, boy, there's a lot to unpack there. What about that really resonates for you?
Earlier on, she had talked about how Columbus came and like God, he named and he named and he named things because to him things were blank, and the way that it erased that things were not blank, that there were an entire culture of people who had been there, who'd always been there, naming their own things. And that just like that, because his narrative wound up being the dominant one in history, he could erase the narratives of all of those other things. It reminds me of Rebecca's restoration, and we talk about recovering stories of the land and our relationship to the land, and part of that is recovering other people's relationships to the lands that were erased. And so it makes me think about when we were talking about how that kid's excitement over the grebe was somewhat erased by that teacher saying it's pronounced grebe. And so again, like, as educators, we've got this potential to fall in love with the excitement of our students and that personal relationship that they're forming with the world around them, instead of, like we've been talking about, using language as a gatekeeper. By the way, that's from Colors of Nature, Culture, Identity, and the Natural World. It's an entire collection of different writers of color. And this particular essay is called In History by Jamaica Kincaid.
Oh, fun.
Fantastic book. If anybody ever wants to form a book club around this one, let me know. I'd love to have some partners reading this with me.
I think that this whole discussion of names might be a fun topic for a future forum. I think there's a lot more to unpack here, and thank you, folks, so much for your thoughts, comments, ideas, and engagement with this. Hope that some of these strategies have been useful to you. We're always, the more that we kind of pick each other's brains for best practices in how we work as educators, the better job we're going to do. And folks, thank you so much for your insight today. I think that having this discussion with you is going to make the workshop I'm about to do with a whole room full of kids a whole lot more fun. Thank you, folks, very much. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. If you're new to the Nature Journal Educators Forum, thank you so much for being here with us. Old timers, it's great to see you again. And also want to thank you, Avea, my co-host, for helping with moderation. Until next time, thank you so much. Be kind. Let's go play in nature.
Thank you, Jack, and good luck today.
It'll be fun.